Do you think it's time to eat the rich? Well, if we did, how big of a meal would that be? How much excess wealth do the wealthy in American society actually have? To get a rough idea of how much wealth would be available under redistribution, and how far away from a more intuitively natural distribution of wealth we are, we can look at data from the Survey of Consumer Finances put out by the Federal Reserve. When we look at a graph of household wealth by wealth percentile, we can see most of society has wealth distributed in a nearly perfectly log-linear relationship between percentile rank and wealth. What this means is that moving up 10 percentiles, or getting richer than an additional 10% of society, requires doubling your wealth for almost every American except the poorest and the richest. The poorest 25% are much poorer than predicted by this rough estimate, and the richest 8% or so are much, much, much richer. So if the point of the market system is to motivate people with material incentives and higher priority for consumption if they do things like earn money or avoid spending, why is there any need or advantage from letting the wealthy have so much more material incentive? The material difference between a grocery store clerk and a computer engineer is enough to motivate many people in society to pursue the more difficult training to become a computer engineer, and the most talented are encouraged by this difference to use their talents to become more proficient computer engineers, and not to secure an easy life as a store clerk.
It's not like it's a demanding job over there.
So the material motivations of the free market or capitalism work for a solid majority of society at the doubling every decile level, and why should it be different for the rich? If we simply extend the trend for the rest of society, that can give us an idea of how much of rich people's wealth is excessive. This expression is the ratio that we should expect from our doubling by decile rough estimate between the wealth of the 50th to 90th percentile and the wealth of the top 10%. The 50th to 90th percentile represent most of the middle class, and this figure is broken out separately in the Distributional Financial Accounts data set from the Federal Reserve, so we can get a very precise estimate. When we do this for fourth quarter 2018 data, the most recent data, we see that of the $68 trillion in wealth that the rich have, about $38 trillion is in excess. As a comparison, all household debt is about $15 trillion, including mortgages, student loans, car loans, credit cards, and a comprehensive set of miscellaneous debts including things like overdraft protection loans. And the federal debt is also about $22 trillion. So the amount of excess wealth held by the rich is about the size of all private and federal debt. That isn't all debt. This leaves out state and municipal government debt and debt owed by businesses and nonprofit entities. But that's still a lot of money. Another way to think about that is that it would be enough to give every American $116,000, or every American adult $150,000. Keep in mind this doesn't touch the wealth of the bottom 90%, and even here we'd still have the richest people in society having about double the wealth of the people in the 80th to 90th percentile. A point conservatives often bring up is that the level of wealth inequality fluctuates during periods of economic trouble. Much of rich people's wealth is in the form of stocks and business ownership, which can fluctuate in value during a market downturn. But when we look at the estimate of wealth in Q1 2009, at the absolute bottom of the 2008 financial crisis, we see that the rich still had about $18 trillion in excess wealth of the $36 trillion that they owned. This represented about 33% of personal net worth at the time, which is very similar to 39% of net worth at present, which is excess rich people net worth. Also keep in mind that net worth only fell about 20% in total off the previous peak during the 2008 financial crisis. The current $98 trillion in household net worth represents a significant growth over the pre-2008 peak. If a similar crisis happened today, we should expect the rich to still have about $26 trillion in excess wealth. Another fact conservatives like to point out is that earning power varies over a career, and this may artificially inflate income inequality numbers. This goes double for wealth inequality. When we look at the richest age category, people just prior to retirement in the 60 to 64 age category, we see that they have almost precisely double the wealth that we see in the overall data. Another way to say it is that these old people have about double the wealth of the average person, at least for old people in the 25 to 90th percentile, which represent most of regular American society. Overall, someone with $1.1 million will be in the 90th percentile, but you need $2 million to be in the 90th percentile of pre-retirement old people. This suggests that the $2 million maximum wealth estimated from the overall data may be too low for old people who are at peak savings. So if we had a $4 million maximum wealth policy, how much wealth would be in excess of that? The answer is about $29.5 trillion, so about 3/4 of our original projection. This is due largely to the absolutely immense concentration in the top 1%. Even the poorest 1%ers have over $10 million, so they'd all have to give up over half their wealth under this policy. Okay, but maybe you're thinking 4 million is too much. If we drop the maximum wealth to $1 million, we'd have about 52 trillion in excess wealth. This would be enough to give every American about $159,000, or every American adult about $200,000. But keep in mind this is digging pretty deep into the wealth distribution at this point. 1 in 5 Americans will reach this level of wealth prior to retirement. In addition, the data this is based on uses households as the unit of measure, so many of these households will likely represent dual incomes from middle-class jobs, which very reasonably can get to $1 million in wealth with prudent savings. As a final note, the amount every American could have with an absolutely even distribution of wealth would be about $300,000. For just adults, the figure would be about $390,000, and for just households, the figure is about $770,000. And that's about the size of it. This exercise wasn't intended to suggest that we should have a wealth limit policy. It was simply to get an idea of how much wealth is potentially available if we choose the right harm-minimizing policies to redistribute it. I hope you can come away with a better sense of the scale of inequality, particularly in wealth, which is not only less frequently discussed than income inequality, but also represents a more severe level of inequality than we observe in income. The top percent have about 20% of income, but own 30% of wealth. When we see the scale in terms of trillions of dollars, it gives you an idea of the actual financial situation of our society, especially when we were thinking about things like the level of federal debt, which is comparable in scale to the excess wealth of the rich. Don't forget to like the video if you've learned something. I'll be making more informative videos on topics in pop culture and politics, so if you thought what I said was interesting, check out my channel and subscribe. I'm Shiva's Right Foot, and I'll talk to you next time.